The fire burned brightly in the village square, crackling as if it had a mind of its own. Old Marco stood in front of the crowd, a grim look on his weathered face. "If we don't change now, everything we know will disappear," he shouted. The crowd fell silent. No one had ever seen him like this before. The earth was fighting back, and Marco knew it was only a matter of time before they lost everything. The ancient soil beneath their feet was dying, and no one could figure out why, until now. Part 1. Marco had always been the keeper of traditions. His hands were rough from years of planting, sowing, and harvesting. But today, as he looked over the fields, something felt wrong. The crops were struggling. The earth beneath him was dry, and the once bountiful trees now stood weak, their leaves curling as if in pain. The young people in the village had long abandoned the old ways of farming, drawn to the city lights and technology. But Marco refused to give up on the land that had been passed down through generations. He gathered the young ones, those who still had ties to the village. "Come," he called, his voice hoarse. "I'll show you how to restore what was lost." But they hesitated. They didn't understand why they needed to follow an old man's ways. They mocked the idea of working with the earth in the old-fashioned way. They wanted shortcuts. "This is how we keep the land alive," Marco said as he pointed to the weathered plow. "And this," he gestured to the compost pile, "this is how we feed it." But deep down, Marco knew that their doubt would not be overcome so easily. Time was running out. They were losing the very foundation of their village, and the harder he fought to protect it, the more they pulled away. Part 2. The next morning, as Marco worked alone in the field, a piercing scream shattered the silence. He rushed to the source, his heart pounding. A young boy, Tomas, had fallen into the well. Marco's heart stopped as he looked down into the dark hole. Tomas wasn't just injured, he was unconscious. Marco's mind raced. He couldn't let the boy die like this. But the well had always been dangerous. It was built centuries ago by his ancestors, deep and narrow, and it had claimed lives before. With no time to waste, Marco jumped in after him. It wasn't the first time he had done something reckless for the sake of the village, but this time felt different. As he struggled to keep Tomas afloat and climb back to safety, Marco couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just fate working against him, it was nature itself. Tomas was pulled to safety, but the incident left an eerie feeling in the air. There was a heaviness in the village now, as if the earth itself was growing angry. Tomas would survive, but the tension between the old and new ways was reaching a boiling point. The village was starting to question the very land they had once cherished. Part 3. Days passed, and Marco's warnings seemed to grow louder. The weather changed. Rainstorms became violent and unpredictable, flooding the fields that once thrived in peace. The crops died faster, and every time Marco tried to teach, the villagers fought back harder. "You're living in the past," they'd say. "We need progress. The old ways are holding us back." But Marco didn't give up. He began to teach them the secret his ancestors had kept for generations, a secret buried deep within the soil. He showed them the ancient art of crop rotation, of planting seeds that respected the earth's natural rhythms. "This is how we survive," Marco said firmly. But with every lesson, the gap between the generations widened. The youth wanted nothing to do with the sweat and toil Marco was teaching them. And then, one night, as Marco lay in bed, something woke him. A strange sensation, a pulse in the earth. He rushed outside, his heart pounding, and stood in the middle of the field. The ground felt alive beneath his feet, almost as if it was breathing. Marco's old bones creaked as he knelt, pressing his hands into the soil. And there, in the darkness, something incredible happened. The soil beneath him began to shift, to come alive in a way he couldn't explain. Was it the work of his ancestors, or was it the land's final plea for help? Part 4. The next day, the village was buzzing with rumors. The ground had been marked, as if by invisible hands. Strange symbols appeared on the crops, growing where the old methods had been practiced. The villagers were frightened, but Marco stood tall. "The earth is trying to tell us something," he said. "We've taken too much. But if we listen, if we follow the old ways, we can still save it." The young people, still skeptical, gathered around him. "What is this, Marco?" they asked. "Why is the land reacting this way?" Marco's eyes glinted with a fierce determination. "The land isn't just reacting, it's responding to what we give it. We have to stop treating it like a machine. The earth is a living thing, and if we keep taking without giving back, we will destroy it." The villagers were silent. For the first time, they began to understand. The earth wasn't just a resource, it was a partner, a living entity. And if they didn't change their ways, they would lose everything. The question remained, Could they learn the old ways in time to save the village? The answer was still unclear, but Marco's hope had rekindled. Maybe, just maybe, there was still time to change things. But as the villagers looked toward the fields, they couldn't ignore the feeling that something darker was closing in. Part 5. The next harvest was unlike any Marco had seen before. The land, though resistant at first, began to respond. The crops grew taller, stronger, and the soil became richer. The youth, reluctant at first, started working alongside Marco, learning to trust in the old ways. But there was still fear in the air. As the village celebrated the newfound fertility of the land, Marco couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something far more significant, and more dangerous. In the distance, a new storm cloud was forming. The sky grew dark, and Marco knew what it meant. The earth, though generous, was still unpredictable. Would the village survive the next test? Or would the land's generosity come to a terrible cost? The storm was coming, and Marco knew the earth had one final lesson to teach. To be continued. Part 6. The storm hit with the force of 1,000 thunderstorms. The winds howled like angry spirits, and the rain came down in sheets, flooding the village in minutes. Marco rushed to the fields, but it was too late. The crops, despite all the work, were drowning. The earth was punishing them for the years of neglect. "Help me," Tomas shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Marco turned, finding the young man struggling to keep his feet in the rising waters. It wasn't just the crops that were at risk now, it was the village itself. Marco's heart raced as he fought against the storm, trying to reach Tomas. This wasn't just a storm, it was nature's wrath. As he pulled Tomas to safety, Marco looked out over the fields. The once fertile land was now a swamp, the crops lost, the soil churning with anger. But as the storm raged on, Marco saw something. A faint light. He followed it, pushing through the rain, and what he found shocked him to the core. In the middle of the flooded fields, a small patch of land was untouched. The earth there was still dry, the crops still growing. Marco knew, in that moment, that it wasn't just the old methods that had saved it. It was something deeper, something more powerful than he could have ever imagined. Part 7. The storm eventually subsided, leaving the village in ruins. The fields were flooded, and the crops were ruined, except for that small patch of untouched land. Marco stood there, staring at it, unable to comprehend what had just happened. How had this small patch survived when everything else had been destroyed? The villagers gathered around, their faces filled with disbelief. Tomas approached Marco cautiously. "What does it mean, Marco?" he asked. "How did it survive?" Marco stared at the ground, deep in thought. "It's not just about following the old ways," he said quietly. "It's about understanding the balance. The land gives us what we give it, but it also takes from us. We can't just take and take. We have to give back. We have to trust in the earth, and in each other." The young people were silent. For the first time, they saw the truth in Marco's words. They had taken the land for granted, believing that it would always provide. But Marco's teachings had shown them the way forward, the way to restore the balance between man and nature. But the storm wasn't over yet. Marco could feel it. The earth wasn't done testing them. The true cost of the old ways, and the future of the village, was still uncertain. Part 8. Weeks passed, and the village began to rebuild. The young people, now willing to learn, worked alongside Marco, planting new crops and following the old methods. They rotated the fields, nourished the soil with compost, and gave thanks to the earth for its generosity. Slowly but surely, the land began to recover. But even as the crops grew, Marco could sense something lurking beneath the surface. The earth had shown them mercy, but Marco knew that mercy came at a cost. The land could not be fully healed in just one season. The balance had been disrupted for far too long. One evening, as Marco sat on the porch of his small house, watching the sunset, Tomas approached him. He looked different, more thoughtful, more grounded. "You were right," Tomas said, sitting down next to Marco. "I didn't understand it before, but I see it now. The earth, it's not just about work. It's about respect. We have to respect it, or it won't give us anything in return." Marco nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of the truth. "It's never just about us," he said softly. "It's about all of us, the earth, the village, the future. We have to live in harmony. We can't take more than we can give." But as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marco felt a shiver run down his spine. The earth was healing, yes, but it was also changing. The forces at play were far more complex than they realized. And though they had learned the old ways, there was a deeper secret buried in the soil, one that would reveal itself when the time was right. And that time was coming. Part 9. The days grew shorter, and the village had begun to find a fragile peace. The crops were thriving again, the fields lush and green, the earth showing signs of recovery. The young people, once skeptical, were now working with Marco, their hands digging deep into the fertile soil. They were learning, adapting, and rebuilding what had been lost. But Marco, despite the progress, couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. The land was healing, yes, but it was more than just the crops, it was something deeper, something he could feel in his bones. The earth had forgiven them, but the balance had not yet fully been restored. The cost of their past neglect still lingered, like a shadow. One morning, as Marco walked through the fields, he noticed a strange quietness. No birds sang, no wind blew. It was as if the entire village was holding its breath. He stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding. There, in the distance, the small patch of untouched land, the one that had survived the storm, was now glowing. A soft, ethereal light radiated from it, almost as if it was alive. Marco's eyes widened in disbelief. The land had never shown him this kind of power before. He approached cautiously, his mind racing. What was happening? What had they missed? Suddenly, Tomas appeared at his side. He, too, had noticed the glow. "Marco, what is this?" Tomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Marco stood silent, watching the glowing patch. "I think it's time," he said quietly, as though he had known this moment would come. "The earth has been waiting for us to learn. It's been forgiving, but it will only give so much." Tomas looked at him, confusion in his eyes. "Give what, Marco?" The ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The earth wasn't just responding to their actions, it was reacting to something more. A sudden realization hit Marco: the land wasn't just a partner, it was a force of nature. They had only scratched the surface of its power. It wasn't about keeping the old ways alive, it was about learning to work with the land in a new, deeper way. A way that involved sacrifice. A way that would require them to give more than they ever had before. The glow from the patch intensified, and Marco could feel the earth calling to him. It wasn't anger, it was something else. It was a warning. The land was teaching them its final lesson. The imbalance wasn't just from their neglect, it was from their resistance to change. They had to adapt or lose it all. As the ground beneath them trembled, Marco knelt and placed his hand on the earth. The energy that pulsed through him was unlike anything he had ever felt. It was a mixture of power and pain, a reminder of what they had lost, and what they stood to lose again. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tremor stopped. The earth stilled, the glow faded, and the quiet returned. Marco stood up slowly, his heart heavy with the realization that the village had passed its final test. The land had forgiven them, but it would not be so generous again. They had learned the old ways, but they had also learned that nature was not something to be controlled, it was something to be respected and revered. Tomas, standing beside him, spoke the words that Marco had been holding inside for so long. "We have to give more, don't we? It's not just about us, it's about everything." Marco nodded, his face solemn. "Yes, it's about the future. The earth gives us everything, but we have to give back. We can't just take. We must live with it, not against it." The village had been forever changed. The young people no longer saw farming as a chore, but as a sacred responsibility. They had learned to give back to the land, to respect it, and to adapt to its rhythms. And Marco, though weary, knew that the legacy of the old ways had finally been passed on. The earth, though powerful and unpredictable, would continue to provide, so long as they remembered their place within it. And with that, Marco turned away from the glowing patch of land, knowing that the next chapter was just beginning. End.